the start of every lesson, it's valuable to go back to your learning map, to go back to your notes from previous lessons, and think about what you have learned so far. That's a part of that participation in learning. It's a part of metacognition, where you're setting your goals, you're thinking about your goals, you're returning to them, and you're seeing how the pieces are connected. Remember that our brain is a mental map, and when we link those pieces together, it's far easier to navigate. So let's start with some review of the unit overall. Think what you're remembering, what's the big idea of the current unit we are exploring, and think about our key learning from the very beginning. What would we say is causing change? Our big idea is change, that in the late Middle Ages, change is taking place. And there's a shifting balance of power. There are redefinitions of social, cultural, political, and economic strength. Now, thinking about this key learning here, what's going to cause that? Hopefully, you said that there are dramatic events driving these changes. And in the first concept, our first two LEQs, we looked at two major dramatic events. Identify in your head what are those events, and think about some of the results that were that happened as after those events. The two big ones we've looked at so far are how the Crusades led to, among other things, the weakening of the nobles and the increase in trade, towns, and the power of the middle class. That all also contributes to the rise of kings. In LEQ 2, what we just finished with the essay, is how the Black Death leads to, yes, terrible suffering, yes, confusion, many deaths, but in the process, it leads to some of the weakening of the church's power because the priests aren't able to save people from the disease. It leads to some new health measures that try and improve sanitation. It leads to some new ways of thinking and innovations in technology. But most of all, it leads to an increase in the value and the income of the peasants. Ordinary workers are suddenly more valuable because there's not enough of them and their labor is in demand. And so as we look at how all of this is kind of combining, we're taking power away from the nobles and giving it to the peasants, the middle class, and in the next couple of lessons, we're really going to focus on how it also went to the kings. Now let's think of some of the specific details. I'm going to present two questions. After each, pause the video, think for 20 or 30 seconds, how would you answer them, and then I'll go over all the answers at the end. So pause and think about these first two. All right, next, think about these pair of questions. These go back to LEQ 1. Try and review LEQ 2. This should be a little easier because it's more recent. And now think about LEQ 1 again, and really even into last unit. Hopefully you said an apprentice who is unpaid, a journeyman who's paid but not independent, and then a master who could work on his own projects or have his own business. And these guilds are like alliances of workers or business owners that's meant to give them power, influence, and control. They're able to control things like prices or how much they're paying for supplies or who's allowed to sell these objects. The middle class gets that name because it's between the peasants and the nobles. These are people who are either working but not on the land. They own businesses or shops. They're merchants. These are mostly people with specialized skills or businessmen. They mostly live in the towns, which we learned were very dangerous at this point. We talked about crime and disease as being the two big dangers. They were also unpleasant because they were crowded and had poor sanitation, and we saw how some of that erupted into the Black Death. Hopefully you remember that we're looking at about 25 million people dying, which represents between 25 and 33% of the population. So we say like roughly a quarter to a third. It's hard to get exact numbers because the data is limited from that time period, especially if you're looking at Europe overall. It's sometimes easier to find records of how it impacted a specific region, but not every place kept good records, and not all of the records have survived. The Crusades were between the Christian Muslims of Europe and the the Christian Europeans of Europe and the Muslim Turks of the Middle East. And those results, like we said earlier, there's more trade, there's more travel, there's better technology, the nobles are weakened, all of that. Okay? So these pieces will all contribute to a lot of the topics that we will explore today. Thinking of review in kind of a different format, the learning map is really meant to be a good tool for you to review our major topics and what we expect you to do with it, and then how prepared that means you are for your test. So again, pause the video here, think of our two big questions and these specific skills and knowledge pieces that we're hoping for, and think about like how many of these do you feel like you'd be ready to do on a test. I would say the one that we probably are least comfortable with is using the databases. We did that a little bit earlier in the unit, but probably not as much as we could have. There won't be any questions about that on the test, and it's something we're going to keep returning to. The rest of these topics, you should have the knowledge and skills to make this happen. And if you need to, that's where maybe you go back and review some of your handouts, or you go back onto the Schoology and see if there's any like quizzes or Quizlet games you can do to practice. In our upcoming lesson, we're going to be looking less at changes in society, like economics and culture that happened with the growth of cities and the Black Death. And now we're going to look a lot at military and political power. And so we're going to think about sort of the evolving, growing power of the kings that took place in the late Middle Ages. And we're basically going to break this into 4 pieces over the next 5 or 6 days. So we're going to start today with a general overview of what changes are giving the kings more power at the end of this time period. This is meant to be big picture. It's meant to give us context so that everything else fits together. We're going to start today and going forward into the next parts of the lesson, looking at what's called the Norman Conquest, when a powerful noble named William came from Normandy, which is in northern France, and conquered all of England and unified it under a single king for the kind of first time in history, especially the first time that lasts. And what this will serve as is an example of how kings during this time period, and William wasn't the only one, he's just the example we will use, were able to take power from the nobles. Then we'll look at conflict, and again, we'll look at one specific example of this bigger pattern of how the kings came into conflict with the church, and that through that process, the kings were able to wrest away a lot of political power and even a good deal of economic power, and start to put the church really focused in the realm of religion. And then finally, we're going to look at an example of one of the largest wars at the end of the Middle Ages, what we might consider to be the first kind of modern war, in that it's between one nation and another, and it's a total war where it mobilizes almost all parts of society. And it will serve as an example of how, again, these kings kind of gained power by unifying their people behind them, by strengthening their identities as a nation, and by consolidating sort of royal strength as they led militaries in these huge wars. So over the next few days, we'll go through all 3 of these pieces. Today, we're going to give the general overview to start. Let's begin by thinking, based on what we've said so far, what has really led to the rise of kings. When you come back, you'll jot a little bit of this down on paper. I've also sent you later in your instructions a link to a small textbook section where you will read a subheading at a time. As you read, you're going to think about how you would summarize individual pieces. On your handout that you eventually get, you will be able to see my first example. I'll have you take care of those notes when you return. At the moment, I'm just interested in you reading and thinking about how you would summarize each of these sections on page 141. You'll then, when you get back, also have access to these notes. So this kind of comes back to that same question about what were the sort of pieces that gave rise to the kings. Pause the video for a moment and think about how you would fill in these blank lines. Essentially, I then presented those to the class. So number one, we've talked about a lot, that the kings were able to gain strength because they really came into a close relationship with these growing towns. These towns were money makers and paid a great deal of support in taxes, which means the kings could pay for their own armies and did not need the nobles anymore. The nobles were further weakened by the Crusades to the point that the kings were able to exercise military strength over them. And when they fought back, the kings thought they'd be strong enough that they could defeat them. And they did. And that's what William's going to be an example of. We'll look at how nationalism, especially new parts of their identity, like a shared culture, shared languages. At this time, people are moving away from Latin and they're starting to speak French and German. They're beginning to publish some of like the first early modern books. All of those things are unifying people together. You know, when you think of today's world, you don't think of yourself first as like a New Oxfordian or a Pennsylvanian. You know, in our heads, we are Americans. And that's because our national identity is one of our strongest pieces. We learn it through symbols like the flag, through the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner at major events. You know, they teach us stories about being American when we are in elementary school. These are, you know, like this is a big piece of who we are. And that process really begins in the late Middle Ages. Up to that point, they mainly identified themselves with their village or the lord whose control they were under, and that was a pretty local bit of power. We talk about how the church and this conflict between the two is coming. We won't talk much about these royal marriages, but we'll see how they played a role in the 100 Years' War. And we're really going to look at how these kings fought against the nobles and fought against each other as a way of consolidating power. And so all of that really works together, and we're going to explore several of the pieces. The other part of your textbook I'm going to have you read is the top of page 142. This is where we're really moving from that general overview into the specific topic of what we call the Norman Conquest. This first example of how kings gained a great deal of strength. And that was done by waging war against other nobles and establishing themselves as the true alpha, the top of the pyramid. And no one's a better example of that than William, who comes from France and attacks England and eventually takes the name William the Conqueror, you know, which is a pretty strong demonstration of his power. And so you're going to read this little preview, and then you're going to use that to kind of have some background knowledge to think about this really cool primary source, which is known as the Bayeux Tapestry. And it's hosted on a museum website from England. You know, museums are increasingly trying to make their digital presence more robust because people want to have access to these artifacts without traveling to specific locations. And they've done a great job digitizing this source. You know, it's a primary source because it's made shortly after the war. It's actually paid for by the king's half-brother, so there is going to be a little bit of a bias to it. But what it more or less is like a 70 meter, which is like 200 feet, so kind of like the length of our hallway. It's this huge tapestry, which is kind of like a mural that is embroidered onto a cloth. And it's like their version almost of a movie. You know, it's not obviously a video. They didn't have that technology then, but you know, it goes kind of left to right. And as you walk along this huge tapestry, you're looking at scenes of this conflict between William and the people he was fighting to gain power. And in the process, it's interesting because you kind of have to pick apart the details of the image and translate the Latin captions. But it also like reveals some of how people felt and thought at the time because these artists put that into their artwork. And so it's a great way for us to learn about this event, especially when combined with some of the other things we know. So I'm going to have you preview this part of their website that introduced some of the people. Tomorrow we'll start with thinking about who is the main characters, and then I want you to just investigate some of the different scenes. And when you click on each of their scenes, you'll get a screen that looks like this. It'll have kind of this big high resolution version of that piece of the tapestry. They give it a chapter title and a scene title, and then like a little description at the bottom. I just want you to click through 5, 6 of these, read the descriptions, read the titles, consider the image and what you can spot, and then hit that next button to move to the next one.